This is the Pan-Africanist, Amani Africa's podcast on current affairs of concern for Africa and African multilateral policy processes with a focus on the African Union. The Summit of the Future is upon us. Member states of the UN are at the tail end of the negotiation on the Pact of the Future, which is expected to be adopted during the Summit of the Future. Are the continent most affected by various global developments, including climate change and the reversals experienced in various areas of the Sustainable Development Goals? Africa has a major stake in the outcome of the Summit of the Future. The latest edition of the Pan-Africanist engages in conversation with Professor Tim Murithi on what Africa's asks constitute and how some of the leading experts in Africa think of the reform of the multilateral system in the context of the Summit of the Future and beyond. Welcome to the Pan-Africanist, Amani Africa's podcast. Today, 10th September 2024, I have the pleasure of sitting down with the one and only Prof Tim Murithi of the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation for a conversation about the Africa High-Level Panel on the reform of the multilateral system that Namibia and Amani Africa jointly initiated, importantly with a focus on the report of the panel, contextualizing it in respect to the upcoming Summit of the Future, where leaders of the world would be gathering in New York for what Secretary General Antonio Guterres described a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for resetting the multilateral system. Prof Tim Murithi is a renowned scholar and policy practitioner with 3 decades of experience in the field of international relations, peace and security, transitional justice. Tim, really wonderful to have you with us for discussing with us this important theme at a time when the world is wrestling with the possibility of ending the fragmentation, fracture, and paralysis facing the multilateral system and trying to reset with a possibility of actually creating a more effective, a more legitimate, and more inclusive multilateral order. From all indications, it appears that the multilateral system, as constituted on the basis of the post-World War II institutional arrangements and even perhaps the post-Cold War power dynamics, has run its course. And as the Secretary General indeed put it in 2021, it's breakthrough or breakdown, and subsequently, as we captured it in the report of the high-level panel, it's rupture or reform. More accurately, many actually describe the state of multilateralism today as one of deep crisis. So in a way, we are at a crossroad of sorts, and this has prompted a lot of policy efforts, including the Summit of the Future being a major example, coming in a matter of 2 weeks. Let's start with the question of what are the factors behind and the drivers of these current international efforts for the reform of the multilateral system.
Thank you very much, Dr. Derso. And let me start by thanking you for inviting me to this podcast and to share some thoughts with you. Secondly, let me thank Amani Africa, Media Research Services, and the government of Namibia for convening this high-level panel of African experts on the reform of the multilateral system, which it has to be said is the first of its kind on the African continent, and therefore a very path-breaking and ground-setting panel. And so I very much commend you and your team at Amani for this very important initiative. And the panel was convened precisely because of the current state of the world that we're in right now. As you have mentioned, we're in what has been referred to as a global inflection point by some, a rupture and a breakdown, if you will, of the basic fundamental institutions that govern the world. If I can focus on the United Nations, specifically, when the United Nations was established in 1945, only 3 African countries were present: Ethiopia, Egypt, Liberia. South Africa was still under the brutal yoke of apartheid. And so Africa's voice, if you will, at the initial inception of the current multilateral system, as we understand it, anchored by the United Nations, but also the Bretton Woods institutions, IMF, World Bank, and later on the WTO, World Trade Organization. Africa's presence at that early stage was insufficient, marginal, and now we are at a stage where the system clearly is not working. Globally, we have geopolitical tension. To name a number of crises on the African continent, the war in Sudan, we have the problem of violent extremism, Somalia, Mozambique. We have the situation in Sahel. And then globally, the war in Ukraine, when Russia has now invaded Ukraine. And in fact, it's important to point out at that stage, Russia was sitting at the Security Council as the president of the Security Council in February 2022 when it initiated this invasion of Ukraine, and obviously the extremely brutal conflict between Israel and Hamas in Palestine, occupied territories of Palestine. So the system, at least the collective security system, I think if we can be so bold as to say that has collapsed, has fundamentally collapsed. It's not working, and it's not delivering security, and it's not delivering peace. And so I think it was a very important initiative by Secretary General Antonio Guterres in 2021 to initiate this conversation. And he called for this Summit of the Future, which is, as you mentioned, will be happening in September, towards the end of September 2024 in New York, precisely to give all international stakeholders, nation states, but also civil society actors, I must mention, and regional actors, the opportunity to redefine, rethink, and ideally reconfigure the institutions for global governance in a manner that will make them fit for purpose in the 21st century moving forward. We have a number of crises at the moment. We've mentioned the geopolitical tensions. We also have the crisis of climate catastrophe. We have food insecurity on a global scale. Almost 800 million people go to sleep without any adequate food to eat. We have a massive refugee problem that has not been seen since the Second World War. And we have major global challenges such as the unpredictable power of artificial intelligence and the questions around how can humanity govern such processes, such phenomena, to ensure that we can in fact build a world that is safer, more peaceful, more inclusive, with improved livelihood for all across the world. So it's an important moment in time to have this conversation, and the high-level panel of African experts that was convened having 5 sessions, I believe, all across Africa, from Addis Ababa to Windhoek to Nairobi, back to Addis Ababa, is an innovative development, and it is commendable that the government of Namibia and Amani Africa took this initiative. As I said, it is the first of its kind on the African continent, and brought together leading thinkers, leading practitioners, diplomatic actors, government officials, to in fact try to put forward an African perspective, at least share African insights and demands in terms of what Africa would like to see in terms of the reform and evolution of the institutions of global governance.
Great. Now, critical to the success in this effort towards a rethink and possibly, as you put it, a reconfiguration of the institutions and rules governing the global system is how the diagnosis of the problem facing the system is adequately captured, the issues ailing the system. And here the question is, how do you think the Africa High-Level Panel fare in doing this? And what are the contributions that makes, from the panel's perspective in terms of its report, towards adequately capturing the issues ailing the system rigorously, so that if you have a proper diagnosis, then the possibility for the kind of response that matches that diagnosis would be one that is critical for success.
Absolutely. And I would commend all listeners and viewers to, in fact, download the report of the panel, which can be accessed on Amani Africa's website. And the panel does an excellent job through its report in providing a historical context as to how we got to where we are here today. And I think this is very important. We should remember that in 1945, when the current system that is dominant was established, as I mentioned, quite a large number of African countries were still under the yoke of colonialism. The countries that defined the multilateral system, some of them were in fact colonial powers, and therefore there was clearly the element of inequality and injustice present in the founding of that multilateral system. And one has to say that some of those undercurrents of exclusion, undercurrents of illegitimacy of the system have prevailed and are in fact with us up to this present day in time. If you simply consider the way firstly, UN Security Council has this presence of permanent 5 members who were the victors and of the Second World War, so to speak, and those who've been excluded, if you will, or those who are on the outside, being those who were in fact subject to the authority of these actors. So it is clear that within the structure, there's an element of paternalism, I think, that persists. There's an element of asymmetry of power. And the report carefully outlines the principles that should be defining our approach to global governance, namely equity, justice, fairness, inclusion. And this is Africa's strong argument and case that if we really want a world in which we are all treated equally, then we have to adopt some fundamental principles going forward in terms of the reform of the multilateral system. And from that come our demands and our appeals for a reform of the international collective security system, reform of the global financial architecture, specific agenda items to address the climate catastrophe and redress for climate injustice in the past. And so I think the report is very commendable and has provided a tremendous amount of analysis, historical context, and very key proposals in terms of how international actors moving forward can in fact create a system that will be much more inclusive and representative in the future.
Great. Clearly, I think that historicization of why we have these crises of paralysis, dysfunction, and fragmentation in the current state of the multilateral system is one aspect of that. And indeed, the ambition of the report is not just to present an African voice, it is actually also to present a reform proposal that caters for the interests of Africa, but one that also befits the needs and interests of all of humanity. I think this is also another important aspect of the report. It's not just about Africa only, but about how we all as the human family should be going about dealing with the collective issues, as you rightly point out, that we face in this world, from the climate crisis to food insecurity, peace and security, to the economic malaise afflicting many parts of the world. I think, indeed, there is something that is much bigger than just speaking for Africa. It is also a voice for the whole of the global world. And I think the point that you made about the panel putting forward the irreducible minimum principles by which the reform should be guided, on which the reform should be anchored, is a very critical and important aspect of that contribution as well. So there are two aspects, in a way, that the report seems to be addressing. One is the structural flaws that were embedded at the time of the founding as a result of the exclusion of certain parts of the world, and by virtue of the fact that, as Antonio Guterres says, the system was designed in a way that favors those who were the architects of the system, right? So there is an inbuilt bias, in a way, in favor of the powerful, and it was not structurally wired and operationally, implemented in a way that is equitable. So there is that side of the equation. The other side of the equation, the report seems to be addressing, as you pointed out, is basically where are we today in this world, okay, in terms of making this system fit for the challenge of the 21st century, both in terms of the peace and security dimensions, given the kind of crisis that you have highlighted in many parts of the world, that the system failed to prevent, and when they outbreak, to contain them. And that is a catastrophic failure, with the kind of consequence that you pointed out, including unprecedented levels of atrocities, as well as, of course, the refugee crisis. But as much as this is a moment of crisis, this is also a moment when the profile of Africa and the role of the African Union in global affairs seems to be ascending. In this context, what is the value proposition of the joint high-level panel on the reform of the multilateral system, and why and how is such an independent expert and African contribution significant for the success of the reform of the multilateral system? So basically, in a way, how does this help address those challenges, and why does it matter?
Indeed, and I think you're absolutely right. The report, the high-level panel and the report, in fact, speak to a much wider context beyond the African continent. And I think I should say that there's also a high level of degree of coherence with the initiative that the United Nations has, in fact, undertaken on its own volition, specifically this UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, who convened a high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism, which produced a number of documents, one of them being the new agenda for peace and a very specific policy brief that speaks to, if you will, the interests of Africa on a range of issues. And so there's a high degree of coherence between the high-level panel of African experts on the reform of the multilateral system and this particular initiative also that's been undertaken by the United Nations in the high-level advisory board. And I think it's important to note that Africa is indeed emerging as a continent that's not only now a recipient, if you will, of multilateral interventions, but increasingly seeking to assert itself not only on the continental stage, but also on the global stage. I think you'll recall the African Peace Mission to Russia and Ukraine, which has its critics and supporters. But on the African continent, the African Union in particular is now called upon to play a much more significant role continentally, but also internationally. And one of the outcomes of the process, the United Nations process leading up to discussions of the UN Summit of the Future, has been the adoption of the UN Security Council Resolution 2719, which identifies the African Union and African-led peace operations as a key anchor to the promotion of peace and security on the African continent. It's important in this regard to see the United Nations essentially in the Security Council in this particular context is tasking the African Union and African-led peace support operations to play a co-governing role, a co-leading role in management of multilateral affairs, in this context, peace and security specifically, which I think contributes also to elevating the African Union and African institutions as key primary pillars of the multilateral system. And this regard, it's very important for African stakeholders to also be on the conversation leading up to the Summit of the Future and beyond, because it will not all be decided clearly at the Summit of the Future, but up to the Summit of the Future and beyond in terms of what are the foundations that we can lay down to, in fact, project the evolution, to curate the transformation of the institutions of global governance going forward. And I think this is the important value added, if you will, of the high-level panel and the report that it has issued is to indicate and to show that there is indeed a certain degree of intellectual reflection, of policy, engagement that is happening on the African continent that should be considered and taken into account in the deliberations that will lead up to the Summit of the Future, but also beyond the Summit of the Future. And in this regard, I think this panel has been an exceptional contribution to this conversation. And as I said, an innovative step forward for the African continent, and perhaps even a model, if you will, for future issues that need to be interrogated in depth with analysis and project African perspectives onto the global stage. And as I said, it's a very commendable initiative by Amani Africa and the government of Namibia.
I think the panel, but also the report, is in a way also a manifestation of this growing interest on the part of Africa to actively engage, not just be on the receiving end of decisions, but also being part and parcel of the decision-making process, not just being on the menu of the decision-making table, but actually being sitting on the table itself. I think that is part of the kind of change and transformation that the panel is imagining, where no part of the world would be outside of the decision-making process, that it would be just a recipient of, decisions taken that have huge consequences on the lives, livelihoods, and future of people without them having any participation in that process. And in a way, it's also basically trying to respond to one of the charges against the current multilateral system, which has to do with double standards, that whether it is in terms of, for example, the way the multilateral system, particularly the collective security system, operates, is in such a way that it doesn't treat equally breaches of international rules happening in some part of the world versus in other parts of the world. The pain and suffering in some parts of the world warrant much greater attention and response and support as opposed to other parts of the world. And part of what the panel is seeking to do is basically, in opening up the space for inclusion other parts of the world, we will also contribute to making sure that this problematic dimension of the international system is addressed, but also all parts of the world contribute to the well-being of the international system and humanity. That basically there are no some givers and others simply takers. That all of us have a stake in a way in this, and we need to be and to have a part and contribution. And it is, if you think about it, despite the characterization of Africa as a charity case, Africa actually contributes enormously to global public good, to the well-being of humanity in so many ways. If you think about it from the perspective of the resources of the continent and how that contributes to global good in so many ways. Now, in terms of the specific aspects of the report, in one chapter where the panel actually goes about defining the problem statement, it used this phrase from Secretary General Guterres, rupture or reform. And the report argues that for Africa, the choice that best serves its interest is reform of the system. That it categorically, unequivocally rejects rupture. In so doing, the report seems to reject the option of the total dismantling of the current system and starting from scratch. What are your reflections on this?
Yes, I think this is a very important aspect of the report. And indeed, it would be very difficult to envisage even how a clean break, a so-called rupture with the current system would in fact transpire. And so the report very much anchors its arguments within the rubric of reform. And in this way, it does echo the views of quite a number of partner countries and regions in the global south. And I think this makes sense because the multilateral system is tasked with quite a vast array of responsibilities as we sit here. And so any type of transition, any type of transformation has to be on an incremental basis, taking into account the responsibilities that the current institutions have for, say, example, refugee protection. And so the report, very much as you stated, is aligned with this theme of reform. And on a number of issues, say, for example, the UN Security Council reform, it has, in fact, echoed the view of the high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism, calling for a reform of the UN Security Council through a much more broad-based conversation initiated by a charter review and activating Article 108, specifically mentioned in the report. And on a number of other issues, it has also emphasized the need, say, for example, the global financial institutions, for reforms that are meaningful and actually illustrate that there is a transition towards a more inclusive and equitable world, specifically on the issue of the voting rights, the assigning of voting power within these multilateral financial institutions, IMF, World Bank, WTO, and also the positions that are assigned to individuals, that we need to see more prominent individuals from the global south, Africa included, within these institutions, because we as humanity really all have something to contribute to the governance of the planet and also to the ideas that are shaping the governance of the planet. So indeed, there is a very strong reform ethos within this report. But it also talks about or hints to the need to think beyond the summit of the future and to also be creative in terms of how we can envisage or conceptualize what a future system of multilateral governance in the 21st century might in fact look like.
Great. You made reference to the reform of the Security Council. Of course, the panel affirms the validity and strategic significance of the African Common Position on the reform of the UN Security Council on the basis of the CERT Declaration and the Idilweni Consensus that calls for, understandably, for ending the historical injustice that Africa suffered from as a result of its total exclusion as the only part of the world from permanent membership in the Security Council and its underrepresentation in the elected category of the Security Council. And the need for addressing this as a special case, deserving and warranting and meriting that special consideration. And one of the arguments that the panel indeed makes is that in a world that is going multipolar, where the possibilities for differences to characterize the nature of the new international order, the way Africa can play a role is basically by being there to facilitate, along with the Global South, a moderating role for the polarization that characterizes the current moment and that may be a feature of the world that we live in, where you have different forms of collectives in the international system. So the presence of the Africa is not simply one of correcting those historical injustices, but also bringing in that voice that has strong stake in the effective functioning of the multilateral system to also play, facilitating the holding of that common ground on the basis of which the international system can work. Now, with respect to the financial institutions and the reform around that, which you mentioned, the report actually reminds us that this is a long-standing issue. And it had a quote at the beginning of that chapter on the reform of the international financial and economic system from Salim Ahmed Salim, the Secretary General of the OAU, at the turn of the century, that quote, which interestingly actually speaks directly to the kind of issues that the world is dealing with. For example, he said at the turn of the century that an equitable, I quote, international economic system committed to development by addressing the scourge of poverty requires, I quote, increasing the level of resource flows to the continent, both through additional quantities and also improving accessibility to such facilities. It is necessary in this regard to ensure that the little growth that is being achieved is reinvested within the countries. The evident trend of repatriating surplus generated from growth, specifically to meet debt servicing schedules, also accounts for the continued prevalence of acute poverty despite some economic growth in our countries. Strengthening and expanding initiatives to alleviate the debt burden, improving the conditions of international trade, ensuring that Africa's voice in global reforms is reinformed. End of quote. Given the fact that these issues, therefore, have such a long pedigree, a long existence, are there reasons to be optimistic that there is a possibility for breakthrough for reform in this area? If breakthrough is not achieved in this area, as the ongoing negotiations on the Pact of the Future, as we speak, suggest from the reform of the financial and economic system being a major sticking point, how bad a setback would that be for renewal of the multilateral system and rebuilding faith and trust in the system?
Yes, and I very much associate myself with some of the points that Dr. Salim has made in his analysis. And indeed, we are at a point of transition, and it will be a breakthrough or a breakdown. It has to be said that those with power very reluctantly cede ground, and so there will be quite a bit of work that needs to be done to cultivate, policy support for the reforms that we are calling for at the level of global financial institutions. There has been resistance, as you stated. This is not a new appeal from the African continent. And in fact, if you go back in time, you will find that similar arguments have been made in the past in terms of the reform of the global financial institutions, but also of the global political institutions like the United Nations Security Council. You've just mentioned the Eswini Consensus, which in fact was issued in 2005. That's almost 20 years of Africa making this case and receiving only lip service. And so early indications are, while we should be cautiously optimistic that there might be some movement in terms of shifting the dial on issues of global reform, at least shifting the narrative, so to speak. The Pact of the Future itself is very much a document that has been negotiated amongst governments and has, in fact, not incorporated a wide array of perspectives from the people of the world, which means that a whole host of ideas that potentially could help to push forward the reform of these institutions have not been included, at least in the current version. But what we hope is that this now presents a point of departure where this debate, in fact, does not stop. It does not end with the Pact of the Future, but it continues. And so the campaign, notably from African actors, African Union, African member states, African think tanks and civil society actors and academics, must continue on this track. And in fact, the aspiration is that there will be some form of a breakthrough, if not this year, at least we look clearly in the near future for some type of shift. Because in fact, the planet is currently on a path of self-destruction. And if we do not change the old type of thinking and the old models of behavior that in fact defined the last 80 years of our existence, we might be facing a even more, fragile and precarious future for humanity, and in our particular context for the African continent.
I think it's important really to put premium and emphasis on the point of how critical and an existential imperative reform is. I think this point is extremely important. And indeed, the Summit of the Future is less than 2 weeks from today, 10 September 2024. And if, as you said, the summit fails short of expectations in various areas of reform, in terms of really doing or committing to the kind of reform that matches the gravity and scale of the challenge that we are facing. And you seem to be suggesting that that shouldn't be the end of basically our effort, that perhaps we should set ourselves in terms of the Summit of the Future as a moment for making some minimum level commitment that sets the agenda for continuing on the path of pursuing the quest for reform. And of course, I think that commitment has also to be somehow concrete. But the important thing, and indeed, I think this is also what the panel's report says. It says the second aspect of the title, the Summit of the Future and beyond, taking cognizance of the fact that the summit is only basically a moment, and the best we expect during the summit may not necessarily be a decision being taken for reform as such, but a decision being taken committing members of the international community, members of the United Nations, to specific reform areas in the realm of peace and security, the reform of international financial institutions along the lines that the report had outlined, in climate change, in governing new technology, including artificial intelligence, addressing the needs and interests of various sectors of society, particularly women and youth, and of course the question also of future generations, which our report also addresses. Prof Tim, I would like to thank you very much for making time to join us for Amani Africa's podcast, the Pan-Africanist, to reflect on the joint Namibia-Amani Africa high-level panel of experts on Africa and the reform of the multilateral system, of which you were a leading part, for which we also express our gratitude.
Thank you very much, Dr. Derso, for having me and for including me in the high-level panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you, our listeners and viewers, for joining us for yet another important edition of the Pan-Africanist. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Following the recording of the podcast, the U.S. ambassador to the UN made an announcement expressing the support of the U.S. for 2 African permanent seats at the UN Security Council. While this has created some excitement as a positive step vis-à-vis Africa's quest for UNSC membership, it doesn't fundamentally change the current status quo. As discussed extensively in the Africa High-Level Panel report, 2 permanent seats without the veto falls far short of what Africa expects. Having the seats without the power that goes with the seats doesn't change Africa's status in the UN Security Council. It actually goes against the fundamental principle advanced by African countries of not having different classes of membership in the UN Security Council. We hope that you enjoyed this edition of the Pan-Africanist, Amani Africa's podcast. We look forward to have you again next time to explore other current issues with other experts. Thank you very much once again for joining us. We are happy to invite you to read the report of the high-level panel, whose link we would also be attaching to this podcast. Thank you again for joining us, and we would appreciate any feedback you may have on the report and the work that we do here at Amani Africa.